Hello, and welcome to Why Do We Do That? A psychology podcast that deconstructs human behavior from the perspectives of social scientists, psychologists, and others that use applied psychology in their work. I'm your host, Dr. Ryan Moyer. In this episode, I sat down with Dr. Cory Clark, a social psychologist whose research focuses on how social motivations influence human judgment and empirical beliefs. Cory earned her PhD in social and personality psychology and quantitative methods from the University of California, Irvine. She also worked as a postdoctoral scholar at University at Buffalo and Florida State University, an assistant professor at Durham University in the United Kingdom, and served as the Director of Academic Engagement for Heterodox Academy. Currently, she is a visiting faculty scholar in the Wharton School and School of Arts and Sciences at University of Pennsylvania, and is the director of the Adversarial Collaboration Project, an initiative which encourages scholars with clashing theoretical or ideological views to collaborate and engage in best practices for resolving scientific disputes. Cory's research provides some significant contributions to the area of motivated reasoning, which is the idea that the way we select and evaluate information can be influenced by our motivations or goals. One of my takeaways was that we need to be cautious when viewing ourselves as objective thinkers and critically examine how our political beliefs might bias how we process information. This bias appears to be automatic and unconscious, which means we are likely engaging in biased thinking without even knowing it. Political worldviews should best be viewed as lenses that alter the way we interpret news stories, facts, and numeric data, and that these lenses can often stifle curiosity and our ability to update our beliefs based on new information. Another takeaway was that individuals are surprisingly sensitive to picking up ulterior motives on the part of information-providing institutions. It seems as though, regardless of political affiliation, we hold governmental, mass media, and academic institutions to high standards, and we will adjust our faith in these institutions when we see them politicizing an issue, even if the bias is in our favor. My discussion with Cory forced me to take stock of some of my strongly held beliefs and look for ways that my political worldview might be potentially influencing views on more specific social and economic issues. I hope after listening that you will be inspired to do the same. Enjoy. Okay, today I am joined by Cory Clark. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
Cory does a lot of research sort of under the umbrella of politics and psychology. You might say it's sort of the overlap between cognition and politics. What spawned your interest in this overlap?
So actually, when I first started grad school, my advisor asked if I wanted to be like his politics grad student, and I was like, no chance, not interested. I think I became interested in it over time, really as a result of doing some research related to political psychology and then seeing the reactions towards that research among some of my peers and being like, wow, this our political commitments aren't just impacting how everyday people think about the world and how they process information, but it affects how scientists think about the world and how they process information. So, psychologists always studying how everyday people are sort of biased and, they strategically search for certain kinds of information and are hypercritical of information they don't like. And at some point, the longer you're in academia, you realize that scientists are exactly the same, and they're also resistant to scientific evidence that opposes the positions they want to believe and are really credulous toward information they want to believe. And so I think it was really seeing that same kind of politically motivated cognition among my scholarly peers that made me finally become interested in the topic, because It affects science and what we publish and what we believe is true and what we tell people is true. And I care a lot about that side of things, like who decides what is true.
Yeah.
And how accurate is that?
And for a long time, I know at least when I was in grad school, there was a feeling of academia is completely unbiased. Like this is everything that we are talking about is focused on truth and objectivity. And there was sort of I don't know, maybe the blinders were on to political bias seeping in. I don't know if that's been your impression.
Yeah, I mean, I should say plenty of scientists will acknowledge the fact that we're just human and thus we're vulnerable to the same kind of cognitive tendencies as everyday people, but some are resistant and they seem to think, well, we're scientists, we care more about the truth, we have this toolkit that helps us discover the truth better than other people, and so we're better, like the things that we believe are true are better than what everyday people think are true, like we have the right methods and the right procedures. And to a degree, that's true, but also to a degree, it's just like a toolkit that helps us construct reality and then convince other people that the things we want to be true are true. And it's a really simple problem to see, because if you just look at the published literature in almost any discipline, you're going to see tons of contradictions. Scholar A says X is true, Scholar B says X is false. There are so many contradictions in the public literature, they can't possibly all be correct. So we know something's going on, right? Some of it's motivated reasoning. Some of it might just be like mistakes that have been made. But when scholars like become associated with a particular theory, they tend to want to cling on to that theory and continue to tell the world that it's true because, that's what they care about. And that's how they get status. And that's how they got their fancy job. So yeah, I don't know if we can say whether scientists are more likely to come to the truth than everyday people, given the way they process information. But at minimum, we have to accept that, scientists have human cognition.
Right.
So we're going to process information the way humans process information for the most part.
So we're going to, throughout this conversation, probably go in and out of talking about science beliefs as they apply to academics, as they apply to the general public. And we're definitely going to spend some time talking about politics and cognition. Why don't we start by looking at some of the broader views that already exist in terms of political psychology. So I wanted to hear your take on Jonathan Haidt's work. So Jonathan Haidt, a social psychologist, and he's argued in the past that the interesting differences between people of different political affiliation is their differences in values, that there's a lot of explanatory power. If you look at conservatives, they are more likely to value things like loyalty, authority. And if you look at liberals, they're more likely to value care and fairness, and those are the values that he chose to use in his examination. To what extent do you think that's a reasonable way to describe differences between people that identify different as different politically?
Well, so here's a really good example of what I was just talking about with the contradictory information in science. I personally am pretty skeptical of moral foundations theory. A lot of other people have been skeptical of it for different reasons. Like Kurt Gray has argued that, all of these so-called moral foundations are just harm-based foundations, and different people care about harms towards different groups of people. Other people have said there are different foundations. I think I've become over time skeptical of a lot of these theories that claim that there are big, consistent psychological differences between people on the left and right, because, they're both just groups of people. So take, for example, one of the moral foundations is like concern for your in-group. And they say, or Haidt and Jesse Graham and colleagues would say that conservatives prioritize in-group loyalty more than people on the left. But if you look at, for example, studies of in-group biases, like do people evaluate information that supports the in-group more than the out-group as higher quality information? Both liberals and conservatives do that to virtually identical degrees. So if conservatives were truly more in-group loyal, they valued that more, you would expect them to show higher biases there, and they don't. And the moral foundations questionnaire is just one questionnaire, and it has a small subset of items, and you could easily swap out those items for other items and those differences might go away. So I'm personally not persuaded by moral foundations theory, but if you looked at the literature, you would see a lot of critics who would criticize it for a lot of different reasons, and a lot of people who actually think it does work pretty well.
So you noted that there were similar similar amounts of in-group bias if you're looking at liberals versus conservatives. You made me think if there's sort of a feedback loop going on with these groups, let's to make it into an analogy, like a cops and robbers scenario. So let's say that there's a lot of in-group bias amongst criminals so that they want to avoid getting arrested, and because of that, as you know, that coming first, then you have law enforcement who in response are trying to protect themselves, and then it amps up their in-group bias. Now I'm making a ton of assumptions here. Obviously, there's a chicken or the egg thing, but do you think that is it fair to say that for perhaps liberals that there's a response to something that conservatives are doing, or a behavior that they're seeing in conservatives?
Yeah, I think it's almost certainly true that both liberals and conservatives are responsive to each other's behavior and might change the rules of the game so as to keep up. So another example is with the moral foundations is one of the foundations is obedience to authority. And this is another one where if you use the scale, you're going to find consistent differences, but other scholars have created different scales of authoritarianism. And people used to think that people on the right were more authoritarian and wanted people to be more obedient to authority figures like on their side, like maybe religious leaders. Other scholars just very recently have come along and be like, well, if we just change who the authority figures are, then liberals are just as authoritarian as people on the right. It's just that they want people to defer to different authority figures. But it's hard to say, like the chicken or the egg problem, like, is one group doing this first and the other group's responding? If so, I don't think anybody would know who is doing it first. And it's all just kind of part of intergroup conflict dynamics, like if you're going to build a bomb, then I guess I have to build a bomb too. Right.
Yeah.
In those cases, you can maybe see who did it first, but not with things like psychological tendencies that are prone toward, in-group loyalty behavior and like obedience toward our authority figures, so it'd be hard to say.
Yeah. So you mentioned the term motivated reasoning earlier, and that line of research was very hot when I was in grad school. So we're talking the late 2000s. And back then, there were a few papers that came out that suggested specifically that conservatives exhibited more, the term was cognitive rigidity. Which sort of relates, it's a related construct to motivated reasoning. It's not the same thing. Could you talk a little bit about the evidence for this area of research?
Yeah, so it used to be, I don't want to say it was uncontested. It was contested, but I think it was generally accepted that people on the political right were more cognitively rigid. This is measured so many different ways in the literature. Sometimes it's like personality scales. The problem is a lot of times these personality scales were written by psychology professors who tend to lean left. So they might be sort of better able to see the topics for which conservatives would be particularly rigid. But the idea was that, conservatives are more resistant to information that's going to challenge their beliefs. they're more like sort of stubborn, I suppose, in their beliefs. And there's been a lot of research showing that that's true. But there's also a lot of research showing that it's not true. And actually, I just recently completed an adversarial collaboration on this project with some people who are proponents of the rigidity of the right, which is the idea that people on the right are more cognitively rigid, people who are on the rigidity of the extreme, which is the idea that left and right, whatever, similar or not, it's really the extremists. So far leftists and far rightists are rigid. And then people in the sort of what's called the symmetry camp, which is like, no, people on the right and left are more or less the same amount of rigid. And when we got everyone together, we went through all of the ways people have conceptualized rigidity in the psychological literature. And we decided the only one that we thought was sort of like a fair measure was whether people update their beliefs in response to evidence that contradicts their existing beliefs. So we used that. And then we looked at people's willingness to update their beliefs on a bunch of different topics. And we just found a bunch of mixed evidence. Like sometimes people on the right were more rigid, some people on the left, sometimes people on the left were more rigid, sometimes there were no differences, sometimes extremists were more rigid. They tended to be, but they weren't always. So when you have this much contradictory information, as a psychologist, you kind of have to say, look, maybe what's going on is we need to stop making such broad proclamations about who's more rigid or say these people are exactly the same, because we can't know if they're exactly the same because we can never measure all contexts. And we also don't have a way to say, like, on whole, this one group is more rigid or not. And so, scientists have these tendency to make these really broad claims, but they're often unwarranted. And the truth is often much less impressive and more nuanced than the headlines that get published, in the New York Times or whatever.
Yeah. Could you talk more about the difficulties that go into measuring these constructs? Because it seems as though, like, if you look at one example of how conservatives and liberals might differ in terms of rigidity, you could say that the source of the rigidity might be different. That conservatives are motivated by perhaps like a religious upbringing, and that's you're not supposed to question religion, and so that may or may not lead to rigid thinking because you're not supposed to question the Bible, for example. So take that as one example. On the left, you might not have those constraints, but we know that today there's some complex energy around race, around gender, and you see what I would consider rigid thinking if you look at some certain specific examples. I don't want to get into the weeds there, but could you talk a little bit about why it's so difficult to say that one group is more rigid than another?
Yeah, I think the example you gave is actually a pretty good one because so I have some studies looking at bias among people on the left, which is often a topic that doesn't get studied much because psychology professors tend to be on the left, so they're not interested in making their own group look biased. But it's precisely the issues you mentioned. It's things they're motivated to be sort of egalitarian and to believe all people are exactly the same. So all racial groups are the same, men and women are exactly the same. And there was this one interesting study that came out a year or two ago, where they presented people with, I think it must have been a description of a scientific study that found that men and women evolve different psychological characteristics. So this is not just that men and women, look different on average, they have different bodies or whatever, but that their brains are also different, and thus men and women have on average different personalities. And they found similar amounts of resistance on the left and the right, but on the right, it was driven by sort of resistance to the idea that evolution had happened and that men and women would have evolved to differences. And on the left, it was driven by the fact that people on the left don't want to say that men and women are different at all, even though they accept evolution. So, different motivations underlying the same resistance to a piece of information, which is kind of entertaining. But I think the reason it's difficult to compare is because it's hard to quantify, like how big is this? Well, first it's hard to say what's true, right? So we can say, oh, this people, people would say people on the right are resistant to the truth about climate change. But it's like, well, we have to talk, what are we talking about climate change? Are we talking about the fact that it's happening? Are we talking about the fact that it's caused by human activity? Are we talking about the fact that it's going to be a disaster, that the temperature is going to go up X degrees or whatever? Like it depends on what fact we're talking about. And then we have to say, what is the actual scientific consensus and how confident should we be given that confidence? So the fact that the truth is a moving target makes it difficult. But yeah, it would just be, I think, essentially impossible to test all ways in which people could be rigid and then try to come up with a number, slap it on people on the left and right, and then compare the two. Maybe we'll do that one day. I don't even know if it'd be a good use of our time to try to do it, though.
Yeah.
So
Well,
in the meantime, I'm
also,
happy to say, we don't really know, and that's fine. Both
sure.
groups do it sometimes.
Oh, and I was also thinking how, if we're looking at how there's a difference in thinking, I'm curious if there's a difference in thinking that relates to the idea of being progressive versus conservative. So generally speaking, progressives are a lot of their values are driven by what needs to change. We are progressing. So you have a lot of attitudes towards we need to change or forward issue A, B, and C. We need to expand gay rights. We need to expand the safety net for people that are struggling financially. And then conservatives, generally speaking, the role is to let's find things that work and hold on to them. Like this sort of really broad definition of conservative versus progressive. Does any part of you think that that it's sort of just a bias in how you approach government more so than any one specific cognitive feature?
Yeah, so I don't want to say that people on the left and right aren't different on average in any ways. There are some fairly replicable differences. I believe it's pretty consistent that conservatives score higher on conscientiousness and liberals score higher on openness on the big five, which is like the most popular personality thing. I don't think the differences are very big, but they're there. When it comes to what you're talking about, this resistance to change, that's another one that people for a long time thought was more characteristic of people on the right. That one's also been challenged and just said, like, if the status quo favors your own side, then you like the status quo, where if changing favors what you want, then you're more in favor of changing. I don't have a strong opinion on that one, because certainly it appears to be part of like the sort of conservative philosophy that's like, we should be cautious if we're going to make any changes, if the system's working okay, because it could get much worse, So like, we should be changing things slowly and not rapidly. And maybe progressives are more like, no, things are terrible, we need to change them immediately and as big as possible. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but
oh well, yeah. I mean, a lot of liberal friends of mine are frustrated with the rate of change. They don't like that slow process. Which, I mean, I would argue that it's it has to be that slow. But yeah,
right. But yeah, the question is it that they're only frustrated with that in a couple of domains for the ones that are headed the direction that they want them to go? But yeah, I think that's another complicated one where there may be a personality difference there. And there certainly seems to be one in the philosophy, but then there's also the comparison between, should we be looking at like conservative philosophers and progressive philosophers, or should we be looking at everyday people? And then it gets much more complicated because everyday people are conservative for so many different reasons. Like maybe it's a resistance to change, but maybe they're religious and they care a lot about the abortion issue. So it gets harder when you're trying to compare these broad groups of people that have self-selected into labeling themselves liberal or conservative for one of who knows how many potential reasons. It could just even be, my friends say they're that, so I'm that too.
Yeah. So just to recap, So it's your position that there there's a massive amount of exaggerating with respect to consistent differences in what, let's just say, cognitive mechanisms.
Mhm.
If that is the case, why is it that so many people would immediately say, of course they think differently?
I think there are a lot of reasons. One would just be psychology has spent so much time looking for these reasons, and we've published a lot of them. So if you keep up with the literature, you'd be like, oh, that makes so much sense. In the
Yeah,
case of moral
you pick up
found
an article. Yeah, if yeah, I remember back in the day when some of this motivated reasoning stuff was coming out. It's like you see it, and it's like that checks out. You know, the
yeah,
classic confirmation bias that I knew all along, and then you hold on to those little nuggets of information, and they don't necessarily get revised or updated.
no, yeah, you don't follow up to see, did anyone challenge this 1 year later? And what did those studies look like? But I do think, I mean, I think motivated reasoning comes back into it because one thing that I found sort of entertaining about the moral foundations when that was really hot back when I was in grad school was people on the left seemed to love it because they were like, oh, we're the ones with the real foundations. We don't have these fake ones that shouldn't matter, like in-group loyalty and authority and purity. So they were like, we have the better foundations. Whereas people on the right were like, oh, we're more moral because we have more foundations. And people on the left are these immoral people who don't even care about, loyalty or being respectful to your elders, like these kinds of things. So I feel like part of the popularity of that theory could be because it made both people on the left and right feel superior to one another. That's the
Yeah,
perfect theory. Like if
yeah,
I could come up with a theory that everyone loved, that would be good for business, I think.
yeah.
Um, so there's a little bit of that. People want to explain how other people can view the world so differently. And so I think we're always, and I think this is true of everything. We have a psychological need to explain things. So if we come up with a theory that makes sense to us, it's often quite appealing, even if it potentially is incorrect, or we have no way of even validating whether it's correct or not.
Do you think that there's any credence to the argument that many people make, specifically on the left? They'll say, well, if you look at the utopia that conservatives want to create, it would be terrible. It would be, we wouldn't be taking care of poor people. We'd always be at war, big military industrial complex. Anything outside of, sort of a religious form of morality you'd be considered bad. Versus a liberal utopia, what's the worst that could happen? Everyone has food. It might not be the perfect capitalistic version of taking care of everyone, or a safety net, but it would the utopias would be different according to the left argument. Do you think there's anything to that?
Um, well, it's a good question because I think the utopia for both sides would be. So I think like for a conservative, it wouldn't be we don't take care of poor people. It would be there wouldn't be poor people because everyone would have a job and they would have figured out how to care for themselves. And so rather than,
Yeah.
some people having to work harder and create more capital and then redistributing that to people, people would have skills and they would have jobs and they would make their own money and take care of themselves. So I don't think the conservative utopia is there would be homeless people on the street and nobody would care about them. It would be there wouldn't be homeless people. They would be working. And that's obviously not I'm exaggerating again because I don't think anyone thinks there would be no homeless people. But yeah, I think in both cases, like the goals I think are for most or all people to be happy and healthy and thriving and crime to be low and hunger to be low. So in that sense the utopias are very similar. I think the real difference is the differences in the beliefs of how we get there. But maybe there would be some differences, as you noted, like probably for some conservatives they would want, everyone to be Christian or something, whereas progressives wouldn't care about that at all. And conservatives would be more okay with there being a certain amount of income inequality, whereas liberals might be like everyone makes the same amount, or at least the difference is very, very small. Whereas conservatives would be like, oh, some rich people and some middle class people and few poor people, ideally.
Well,
So
and one of those that the differences that I constantly think about is what works in a small community versus what would work for a country. Like it seems as though this sort of if you look at a small family, parents give their children resources and they don't really expect a ton in return. It's not like if they don't do their chores, they don't eat. This kind of selflessness and some of the foundations that would underlie socialism works really well in a very, very small setting. And then the real question seems to me is what happens if you apply it at a country level. That's where there seems to be a lot of disagreement.
Yeah, what happens if you apply it, and even can you apply it? Because you're dealing with, some people feel like they're paying too high of taxes, and that money is getting taken and it's going where? They don't even know who's getting it. What is it paying for? Is it helping my community? Or, is it going to another state and helping people there? I think like there's a debate about how well you can achieve that kind of we're all going to take care of each other attitude, and go from a community where everyone kind of knows each other and can kind of keep track of each other and kind of knows where the money's going. It's going to the local school. Okay, everyone supports schools, so that's cool. And then you make that much larger, and now people have absolutely no idea who they're helping or where their money's going. And then maybe understandably, they're a little bit more resistant to taking care of other people because they're strangers. Right. So there's a question of, is that something that can work with human psychology? Is that something that humans on average are going to be okay with? And if they're not, should we accept that, or should we push them to be okay with it? Where progressives might be more like, well, too bad. I don't care if you're not okay with it. That's how it's going to be. Whereas conservatives might be like, well, we have to deal with the fact that this is a normal human reaction, and, come up with a better solution, perhaps, maybe more localism.
So let's pivot a little bit and talk about your work on science beliefs, which is it's very much related to what we're talking about, but you look at some very specific and interesting questions in this area. First, you have some work looking at specifically I knew I was going to screw up this word. Politicization.
Politicization.
Politicization. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
There's
I
an
may
S
or may
and a
not
Z.
have made that word up, so it's fine if you don't know how to pronounce it.
Yeah. But making public issues political, or making issues that are normally should be discussed in an objective way, adding a little sprinkling of politics to them. Could you talk about that work and what we need to know about that?
Yeah, so that's one of my favorite projects I'm working on right now. We have 6 studies now, and we've looked at this across 40 different institutions. We tried to pick important ones like the Supreme Court, criminal justice system, the World Health Organization, professors, scientists, local business people. Those are some of the example institutions. But we also look at this among academic disciplines, so like economists, public health scholars, psychologists, physicists. And we looked at how perceptions that these institutions and disciplines, perceptions that they allow political values to influence the work they do. That's essentially how we operationalize what we're calling politicization. It's the view that political values impact their work. As people view institutions as more politicized, they trust them less. They're less willing to support them, to provide financial support for them, to listen to their expertise. And we tested this also experimentally. So in 2 studies, we made up these organizations. One of them was like Economics Professors of America, and the other one was Get Outdoors Park Rangers of America, or something like that. And in one case, the group endorsed Biden or Trump for president in the 2020 election. And the other case, this was the economics professors. They had like a senator who was a Republican or Democratic speak at their conference and talk about how political values should influence the research agenda of this group. And we see that when these institutions that are supposedly doing something else, they're protecting our national parks or they're teaching people about economics, when they get involved in politics, trust towards them goes down and support of them goes down. And we see this among people on both the left and the right. So this was what was most interesting to us, because we see even among left-leaning people, if a left-leaning institution, say, academics, for example, or journalists who lean left, if they get involved in politics and they support left-leaning politics, left-leaning people still trust them less. And we see the same thing for the right-leaning people. So when a right-leaning institution tries to support right-leaning politics in their work, right-leaning people trust them less.
That's surprising.
It is surprising, because you would think, well, why wouldn't people want these powerful institutions supporting their own ideological agenda? That would work out in their favor. But people seem to really not like this. They really don't like it when it goes against them, but they even don't like it when it supports them.
Do you think that they don't like it because it weakens their position, in the sense that we can't use this information, like because I can't use this information against my opponent because they're compromised, or they don't like it for some other reason, right?
Well, so I don't know what the reason is, but I thought of 2 main reasons. One is maybe more wholesome, and the other is maybe more
cynical.
A little more cynical. So one would be that people think what these institutions are doing is really important. So people think science is important. They think the criminal justice system is really important. And they don't want those institutions alienating a large chunk of the population, because they want us all to cooperate when, we're in a situation where we need to be listening to the authorities. Like, we need to be able to trust scientists. During COVID, wouldn't have been great if we all could have trusted scientists, although that had its own problems, but it's a good example anyway. So it might be that people think these institutions are so important. We need people to be able to trust the Supreme Court, criminal justice system, journalists, because that's where we get our information. And if half of the country can't trust them, we're going to not be able to coordinate when it comes to solving problems as they arise. The other one is, it might just be that, so these institutions have more power than any one person, right? Like me as Cory Clark can't tell anyone to believe anything or do anything. But if I say like, oh, I'm a scientist and I have a PhD and I'm at University of Pennsylvania and I published this paper in this top tier scientific journal, this is one of the best science journals in all of science, you have to believe what I say. Like, then you get a little bit more power, right? And so it might be that people see these powerful institutions, and then they see the people within those institutions as abusing the power and the influence of the institution to forward their own agenda. And then people might not like that, because it kind of seems like cheating. Like, we're all here to debate one another and try to figure out, what's best for the country and each other. And if you, an individual, take advantage of your position of power in this powerful institution, you're essentially like trying to manipulate other people illegitimately by working through the influence this institution has. So that's maybe one possibility. I don't exactly know why people don't like it when institutions forward. I mean, personally, so there was this drama that happened recently. I think it was the journal Nature, the Nature Springer family of journals. They endorsed Biden. And then this scholar studied the impact of that endorsement of Biden on attitudes toward Trump and Biden. And it had little effect on attitudes toward Trump and Biden, but it did make people trust the journal less and it
Interesting.
made people trust scientists in general less.
Yeah.
And this became a bit of a drama because a lot of scientists, almost all of whom are left-leaning in psychology, those are the people that I know, almost all psychology professors are left-leaning. A lot of them did not like that nature endorsed Biden. And in that case, to me, it was probably because, well, now they're undermining the reputation of the entire institution of science. So they're using their position of power to try to make a political maneuver. And in the meantime, they're costing all of us legitimacy.
Yeah.
But they're in the in-group, right? Like they're part of the group of people that's paying the price for the politicization.
Yeah.
So that's probably happening too. And we saw that in our research. If this one sub-organization, Get Outdoors Park Rangers of America, endorsed Biden or Trump, then people were less trusting of all park rangers in general. So it has these like bleed out effects where it sort of infects the entire professional group when one subgroup of those people get involved in politics when that's not part of their stated mission. Their mission is to, inspire people to go to the national parks.
Do you think that you would have found similar results 30 years ago in the sense that you could make the argument politicization has been consistent for a variety of domains? I mean, technically speaking, you could say, well, if I don't know, let's say if Planned Parenthood in 1988 was saying that sexual orientation is largely genetically determined, it's like, oh, well, they're being political by saying that because they're pro-gay rights or something like that. It doesn't feel like there was as much of this idea of politicization going on 30 years ago. I don't know what you think about it.
So that's a good question. I don't know for sure. I have tried to find other similar studies on this, and I recall one that they covered some kind of political controversy surrounding the HPV vaccine, which I didn't even really know that there was political controversy surrounding the HPV vaccine, but apparently there was. And I guess that had undermined trust toward doctors when people saw it was being politicized. And that would have been, I don't know, when was the HPV vaccine becoming a big thing? Like 20 years ago, 15 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, you can no one's going to fact check this, but I'm sure it was.
Sure.
I believe it was
some time ago.
Late 80s, early 90s, probably.
Oh, okay. So that would be a long time ago. Yeah, don't quote me on my description of the study because obviously I don't have a great memory of it. But so it seemed like possibly this sort of effect was around then. But I think you bring up another important issue, which is there are also two other things happening. One is institutions don't want to frame their activities that almost everyone would say is like a political activity. They don't want to frame them as a political activity, right? They want to say, no, this is just the true thing. This is just the right thing. So like when science endorsed Biden, they didn't say, oh, we just like Biden. They said he's better for science, right? So they made it about the science and not about him per se. I mean, it was both. But in any case, they try to make it seem like a non-political act. And then at the same time, people are also
arguably, but that's arguably disingenuous in the sense that, so what's really interesting about this topic to me is that there's always a certain amount of corpse speak going on, which is nature endorsing Biden, and it almost feels to me as they're going wink wink, this is objective. Part of the marketing campaign knows that there's a wink wink attached to that public message. I'm curious.
I don't know.
We'll see that.
Maybe.
Who knows? It makes me curious if people are reading into that. So when someone is saying you're politicizing by endorsing Biden, are people picking up on the disingenuousness, or are they, or is it something? Is it just driven by what they're saying?
Well, I think in the real world, it's probably often both. So I'll say this, even with all of the science that shows that conservatives are more cognitively rigid, like on the one hand, you could be like, oh, this is a bunch of left-wing professors saying conservatives are bad people. But a lot of them are just sincere believers, and they're like, no, we're just literally reporting true information, and that's it. This is not a political statement. It's a science statement, right? So like some people might be aware that there's a motivation going on, but a lot of people probably aren't. And the same when Nature endorses Biden, maybe some of them are like, yeah, we just really like Biden and we hate Trump and we have a lot of power. Let's use it. But some of them might just be like, our interests are the interests of science. And we see one president who is likely to support, the science funding institutions, and that's good for us. So this isn't about politics. This is about science. And I don't know, like, so there's that, like on the side of the people doing the behavior, they're of course going to try to disguise any political maneuver as, no, this really is part of our mission. It's not just a political thing. This is, we say we're like, take a left-leaning news network, right? They're not like, oh, we're saying that we like this president, or this president did this great thing and this president did this terrible thing because we're left-leaning and we know our viewers like us saying pro-left things. They say, we're just reporting the news. We're just saying what's true. And like, do any of them detect that there's a bias there? Or do they just literally think that's what they're doing? I don't know. But then on the part of the audience, the same thing's happening, where if an institution is supporting my group with a political maneuver, I'm less likely to see it that way. So we do see that even right-leaning people don't like when right-leaning institutions become politicized, but I'm less likely to think a right-leaning institution is doing something political than a left-leaning institution. And this goes both ways. So left-leaning people are more likely to think right-leaning institutions are doing political things and vice versa. So the audience is motivated to downplay the political aspect. The person spreading the message is going to try to downplay, which is interesting that people are still claiming it's happening all the time. I suggest people aren't doing a good job disguising their behaviors as these totally apolitical. No, we're just sticking with our mission of keeping Americans safe or whatever. Like there was another paper looking at this with doctors, surrounding the whole COVID thing. And what treatments were effective, and doctors, physicians, political attitudes affected their beliefs about which treatments were the most effective. Is that their sincere beliefs that were manipulated by their politics? Is it a political maneuver to say it in the first place? Oh, I'm going to go on this news show and say this thing works or this thing doesn't work, and get points with my political tribe,
Yeah.
It's complicated.
Well, we could spend an entire other episode talking about the psychology of COVID information processing. But you also have some interesting data on censorship, and public attitudes towards censorship. So to what extent does the general public endorse censoring certain types of information?
Yeah, so I've asked that question a couple of times. It would be hard for me to put a number on it because I presumably would have asked this on like a continuous scale. But some subset of people think that scientific information is too dangerous and it needs to be censored. And some scientists support those attitudes too. But it's hard to know what they're talking about. So some scientists would endorse censoring, even something like studying psychological differences between men and women. But then there are other topics like, get back to COVID, like gain of function research. Well, how many people think we should not be doing gain of function research if it has potential to unleash deadly pathogens on the world and kill a lot of people? Probably a lot more people would say we shouldn't be studying that. But there is some support for that. And we see some support for that among scientists as well, although I do think scientists are a little bit lower in their support for scientific censorship.
Were there any interesting individual differences that predicted, what would be driving someone to believe that keeping information from people is beneficial?
Yeah. Are you talking about the harm hypervigilance paper?
Mm-hmm.
I have a couple papers looking at this topic. Yeah, in the harm hypervigilance paper, we found that people who have a tendency to overestimate the harms of science are more likely to say we should be censoring science. So we presented people with a sets of controversial or potentially controversial findings. One of them was, and most of them or all of them were actual papers that had been published at one point. Some of them had been retracted. But for example, one of them was looking at mentorship between men and women, and men and women mentees, and they found that like the woman-woman combo, those scholars were less productive than the man-man combo. That paper got published and then retracted. And we had one subset of participants estimate like how many people would support all of these policy reactions to those findings. And another group just report whether they support various policy reactions. And we see that people tend to overestimate all the bad things and underestimate all the good things. So people are more likely to say, people will say that women shouldn't be allowed to mentor women anymore without this like specialized training that only women have to take or something like that. Whereas not that many people support anything like that. And people underestimate things like we should give women resources, to use at their own discretion to help them or whatever. So we have these sets of findings that people consider harmful behaviors people consider harmful and behaviors people consider helpful. And on average, everyone overestimates the harm and underestimates the benefits. But people who are particularly prone to overestimating the harms are more likely to say we should be censoring science.
Mm-hmm. Now, if you had to summarize some of the directions that your research is heading in, it seems as though you're sort of converging on this idea that public institutions need to be very careful about their tactics, how they put out information. They need to understand a little bit about how people are going to process what they say, about how they present it, whether or not they endorse a political candidate. As we wrap up, could you talk about what you think public institutions need to do in order to maintain a trust with the public?
Oh, that's a hard question. Yeah. I don't know. I guess I would say stick to your mission to the best of your ability. Don't feel the need to get tangled up in all of these political issues. I have wondered, like, I would like to know, I should read more about it, but I would like to know what happened with the Bud Light fiasco. Like, how many people made that decision? Was it driven by one person or a lot of people? Like, how many higher ups approved that? Because, whether or not you think it was the right thing to do or not, it's anyone would have the foresight to know, like, this is going to be a divisive issue. But let's dive in anyway. And the same goes for some of these policies that have been pushed by a lot of the Nature Springer family of journals. They're saying we're going to consider the potential harms of science before we decide whether to publish something. So they're saying we're going to use our own moral assessments of science to determine whether something's worthy of getting published or retracted. And that is a big change in comparison to what I think people thought they were doing, which was publish the best, most rigorous science that comes your way and reject the bad stuff. And so these journals or other institutions make these sort of really public maneuvers, and people are, watching what's happening. And there was also that controversy with the M&Ms. Like, they thought one of the M&Ms was obese or something.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what M&Ms was doing, if they did anything at all, if they're just like, everyone likes our candies dancing, and then it became political somehow on accident. I actually think they probably handled that one quite well, right? What did they do? They're just like,
If we're
everyone
not
loves
talking
Moyer.
about it, they definitely did something right.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So yeah, so
Well,
sometimes things can be interpreted as politicized when they're really not, so that's always a risk an organization's going to be running. But I think like,
and you also, just by bringing up that idea that journals or publishing institutions are being very public about favoring certain types of research, that scares me, because it feels like that you could make the argument that that's definitely going to be perceived as politicization, by saying, we're not. It's what scares me about some of these. I know that the JPSP, the Journal for Personality and Social Psychology, I hope this is the specific journal, but I believe they've gone on record saying that they are going to favor certain types of papers over others.
I wasn't aware of that one, but it seems perfectly plausible. Yeah, so with the case of the Nature Springer, and they're saying, we're going to consider the potential downstream harms. It was very unclear. Like, one thing they said was research that has the potential to undermine the dignity of human social groups. And it's like, well, that's a very precise moral concern. Like, why not be concerned about research that has potential to cause nuclear war, or research that has potential to unleash a deadly virus, or whatever it is? Like, there's so many things, so many potential harms to worry about. To select one particular one, it feels very political. It feels like the editors at this journal share some political view and they think this is the most important thing. And so even though for the most part we're going to focus on rigor on this one topic, no, we might reject stuff just because we think that it offends our personal moral sensibilities. And without even providing evidence, for that matter, that some of these papers are, I don't know how you measure whether something undermines dignity, but like, at least it would be good to know, well, how do you measure it? What is your quantify dignity for me? And then show how science can undermine that dignity. Because to me, like, dignity might even be a completely non-empirical thing. It might be just like it might be a value. Like, everyone deserves dignity no matter what we publish. So it's quite bizarre. And yeah, I suspect that Nature already has and will continue to pay a reputational price for that. And then if they do, then maybe another journal will come along and won't do that. And then maybe they'll, outcompete Nature. I guess we'll see.
Well, thank you for coming on. Your work is, it has a very timely flavor to it. You're definitely diving into questions that are relevant today, rather than sort of, some of the main staples of psychology that are sort of grounded in the past. Everything that you're looking at seems to be very relevant, and so I applaud you for that. Thank you so much.
That I go where the drama is.
Perhaps. Thank you so much for being on today, Cory Clark.
Thank you very much for having me. This was fun.
For more on Cory, visit CoryJClark.com. That's CoryJClark.com. If you enjoy this podcast, please share an episode with 2 of your friends. Follow the Why Do We Do That Facebook page for updates and additional content. Don't forget to rate and write a review on Apple Podcasts. Follow on Instagram at Why Do We Do That Podcast, or Twitter at WDWDTpod. As always, feel free to email me with comments or guest suggestions at whydowethatpodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, this is Dr. Ryan Moyer, hoping you found some answers to the question, why do we do that?